The morning Theresa Sawyer was supposed to become another man's wife. The sky above Caldwell, Kansas, turned the color of a bruise, purple and swollen at the edges, as though the heavens themselves were holding their breath against what was about to happen. It was the spring of 1882, a time when the cattle drive still thundered through the southern plains, and the railroad had just begun threading its iron fingers into the heart of the frontier. Caldwell sat right on the border of Kansas and the Indian Territory, a town that smelled of horse leather, wood smoke, and ambition, where the saloon stayed lit until sunrise and the church bell rang every Sunday morning as if it could save everyone who had sinned the night before. It was a town of contradictions, and Theresa Sawyer had lived every one of them. She stood before the small mirror in her childhood bedroom, the one her mother had carried all the way from Tennessee in the back of a wagon when Theresa was barely 3 years old. The dress she wore was ivory cotton with pearl buttons along the spine, and her dark hair had been pinned up by her younger sister Clara in the way that Clara had seen in one of the fashion papers that sometimes found their way out to the frontier. It was a beautiful dress. It was the most beautiful thing Theresa had ever worn, and she had never felt so completely hollow in all of her 23 years of living. Her father, Edmund Sawyer, appeared in the doorway. He was a broad man with calloused hands and a gentle face that had been weathered by years of Kansas wind. He looked at his daughter the way a man looks at something precious he is being asked to give away. "The Reverend Fletcher is ready," he said quietly. Theresa met her own eyes in the mirror, brown, steady, and afraid. "Papa," she said. Edmund came forward and placed his hands on her shoulders. "I know, Theresa, I know you have your reservations, but Gerald Fitch is a good man. He has land. He has a solid name in this county." "He is 41 years old," she said, and though her voice did not shake, everything behind it did. "He is established," Edmund said firmly, and there was something in his tone that told her the conversation had already been had a dozen times before and would not be had again. "Your mother would have wanted security for you. I want security for you." Theresa looked at her father's reflection in the mirror, at the lines around his eyes and the gray creeping into his beard, and she thought about how much he had sacrificed after her mother died 3 years ago. The Sawyer farm had not recovered well from the drought of 1879, and Edmund had borrowed money from Gerald Fitch's bank to keep the cattle through the following winter. That debt had never been named outright in any conversation about this marriage, but it hung in the room like smoke that never quite cleared. She picked up her small bouquet of wildflowers that Clara had tied with a piece of blue ribbon, and she turned away from the mirror. "All right," she said. The town of Caldwell was not large, but it had a proper church, a white-painted building on the northeast corner of Main Street that Reverend Fletcher kept swept and tidy. By the time the Sawyer family wagon rolled up to the front, a modest crowd had gathered. Gerald Fitch's friends and business associates stood on one side, men in good coats and polished boots, and the townspeople who had known Theresa since she was a girl stood on the other side with smiles that were warm but careful. Gerald Fitch stood at the front of the church, talking to the Reverend when Theresa entered. He was a tall man, not unpleasant looking, with silver at his temples and a careful way of holding himself that communicated he was accustomed to being in charge of things. He turned when he heard the door open and he smiled at her, and it was the smile of a man who had successfully completed a business transaction. Theresa smiled back, and every muscle in her face worked hard to do it. She had made it halfway up the aisle when the church door swung open behind her with a bang that made half the congregation jump. The man who stood in the doorway was not someone she recognized immediately in that first suspended second. He was tall, somewhere around 6 feet, with trail dust still settled on his dark coat and the kind of hat that had seen too many seasons under the open sky. He had dark eyes that moved quickly through the church the way a man's eyes move when he is looking for something specific, and does not intend to stop until he finds it. He was 26 years old, though he carried himself with the particular gravity of a man who had lived twice that inexperience. His jaw was square and set, and there was a long, thin scar along his left forearm that disappeared under his sleeve, a reminder of a night in the Texas Panhandle 2 years prior that he rarely spoke about. His name was August Trask, and Theresa Sawyer knew him. She knew him from 3 years ago, from the summer before her mother died, when August had worked 2 seasons on the Sawyer farm as a hired hand before moving on south toward Texas to work a cattle drive. She had been 20 then, and he had been 23, and there had been something between them in those months that neither of them had ever properly named, because naming it would have required both of them to be braver than the circumstances had allowed. He had written to her once, from a town in Texas, a single letter on plain paper that said very little and somehow said everything. She had written back. He had not replied again, and she had told herself it was because men like August Trask were not built for roots, and she had gradually persuaded herself that she had forgotten him. She had not forgotten him. The church was absolutely silent now. Gerald Fitch had turned around with a look of restrained irritation on his face. Reverend Fletcher had stopped speaking mid-word. Clara, sitting in the front pew, had pressed her hand over her mouth. August walked down the aisle. He did not run. He walked the way a man walks when he has made a decision so completely and utterly that hurrying would be beside the point. He walked until he was standing 3 feet from Theresa, and when he looked at her, it was with an expression of such raw and unguarded honesty that she felt something in her chest crack open like spring ice. "I need to say something," August said, and his voice carried through the church with perfect, quiet clarity. Edmund Sawyer rose halfway from his pew. "August Trask, this is not the time or the place. With respect, Mr. Sawyer, I believe this is exactly the time and exactly the place," August said without taking his eyes from Theresa's face. "Because if I don't say it right now, I'll spend the rest of my life knowing I had the chance and I walked away from it, and I'm not willing to do that again." Gerald Fitch took a step forward, and his expression had gone past irritation into something colder. "Son, whoever you are, I suggest you. My name is August Trask," he said evenly, glancing at Fitch just long enough to acknowledge him, "and I'm not here to cause a scene or disrespect anyone. I'm here because there is something true that needs to be said." He looked back at Theresa. She had not moved. She was still holding her wildflower bouquet in both hands, her knuckles white against the stems, and her eyes were very bright. "Theresa," August said, and just the sound of her name in his mouth was different from how anyone else said it. "I left 3 years ago because I was a fool. I thought I had nothing to offer you. I thought a man without land and without a permanent name in any county had no right to stand in front of a woman like you and say what I wanted to say. I was wrong about that. I know that now." The church was so still that she could hear the Kansas wind pushing against the walls outside. "I have spent 3 years working every drive from Caldwell to Abilene. I have not spent it carelessly. I have a stake now, real savings from honest work, enough to build on. But that's not the point." He took a breath. "The point is that I love you. I have loved you since the summer you argued with me for 45 minutes about whether the north pasture fence needed replacing, and you were right about the fence, and I think you've been right about most things I've ever disagreed with you on, and I'd very much like the rest of my life to keep finding that out." A sound came from Clara in the front pew that was something between a laugh and a sob. Theresa's throat was so tight she could barely breathe. "August," she said, and her voice came out barely above a whisper. "You don't have to do this," he said, and his voice had gone very gentle. "If you want to marry Gerald Fitch, if that is truly what you want, I will walk back out that door and I will not trouble you again. But I needed you to know that you have a choice, that you have always had a choice, and that if you want a different one, I'm standing right here." Gerald Fitch moved toward them both, his face now fully controlled and cold. "This is absurd," he said, a sharp edge in his voice. "This man is an itinerant cowboy with no property and no standing. Theresa, your father and I have an understanding." "What kind of understanding?" Theresa said. She surprised herself with how steady her voice came out. She turned to look at Gerald Fitch, and then she looked at her father, and something in her father's face told her everything she needed to know. The debt. The money borrowed from Fitch's bank. The winter that nearly broke them. "Papa," she said quietly, "is this marriage meant to clear a debt?" Edmund Sawyer looked at the floor, and that was the only answer she needed. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 5 seconds, but it felt much longer than that. "Mr. Fitch," Theresa said, and she turned to the man she had been about to marry, "I believe you are not a cruel person. But I also believe that you understand in your heart that a wife who does not choose you is not actually a wife at all. And I think you deserve better than that, and I know that I do too." Fitch looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at August, and some calculation happened behind his eyes, and then he gave a single short nod, the kind of nod a man gives when he knows an argument is already lost. Theresa turned back to August. "I wrote you back," she said. "You never replied." "I know," he said, and the honesty on his face was painful. "I was afraid. I'm not afraid anymore." She looked at him for a moment that stretched out wide and full, at the dust on his coat and the seriousness of his dark eyes and the way he was holding himself very still, the way a man holds himself still when he is trying not to show how much something matters. She placed her wildflower bouquet down gently on the nearest pew. "Then we have a great deal to talk about," she said. August Trask let out a breath that sounded like it had been held for 3 years. Edmund Sawyer sat back down in his pew and put his face in his hands, though whether from relief or grief or some combination that only fathers understand, it was difficult to say. They walked out of the church together, not touching yet but close enough that the distance between them felt like something deliberate, something about to be crossed. The sky outside had changed. The purple bruise of the morning had broken open, and the Kansas sun was pouring through a gap in the clouds with the full warm weight of late spring, flooding the street in gold. They stood on the wooden sidewalk in front of the church, and the town went on around them as it always did. Horses at the hitching posts and a delivery wagon lumbering down Main Street, and the smell of the bakery 2 doors down. Normal, everyday Caldwell, Kansas, in the year 1882. Theresa looked at August and August looked at Theresa, and everything felt both very large and very small at the same time. "You look different," she said. It was not quite what she meant to say, but it came out first. 3 years older," he said. "Steadier," she said. "I had to become that," he said. "I had reasons to become that." She looked down at her hands, still remembering the shape of the bouquet they had been holding. "You should know that my father is in debt to Gerald Fitch's bank. That is not going to disappear just because I walked out of that church." "I know," August said, "and I intend to address that." She looked up sharply. "You don't owe my father anything." "No," he agreed, "but I intend to ask your father something that will make it my responsibility too, if he'll allow it." She understood what he meant, and the understanding moved through her warm and slow, like sunlight through glass. "August," she said carefully, "we have not spoken in 3 years. We were never even, we never said, 'I know what we were,'" he said simply. "Do you?" She thought about the letter she had written back to him, the one she had spent 2 evenings composing and had finally sent with a writer heading south. She thought about the way she had kept the single letter he wrote to her in the drawer of her nightstand beneath a handkerchief for 3 years and had never told anyone about it. "Yes," she said, "I know what we were." "Then let me prove what we can be," he said. "Give me time, not much, a reasonable amount. Let me show you that I'm not the same man who left without saying what needed saying." She looked at him for a long moment, measuring the distance between who he had been and who he was standing in front of her now. "You'll need somewhere to stay," she said. "You can't sleep in the livery." He almost smiled. "I can sleep in a great many places." "You'll stay at the boarding house on 3rd Street, she said firmly, with the tone of a woman who has already decided. "Mrs. Hollis runs it and she's decent, and you'll come to dinner at our farm on Sunday. Papa needs to hear whatever it is you have to say from your own mouth." "Yes," he said. "And August," she added, "yes. Do not buy me anything. Do not try to impress me with money. Just be honest with me. That is all I have ever asked from anyone." He looked at her with those dark, serious eyes, and he said, "That I can do without question." The days that followed were not simple, because very little in Caldwell in 1882 was simple when a woman walked away from a wedding to a prominent banker. The town talked, as small towns do, with the thoroughness and dedication of people who have decided something is interesting. There were opinions expressed at the general store and at the barber shop and at the two saloons on Front Street. There were women who admired Theresa's courage and said so quietly to each other, and there were men who thought August Trask had no business inserting himself into arrangements that did not concern him, and said so somewhat louder. Gerald Fitch behaved with considerably more dignity than most people expected. He was not a warm man, but he was a proud one, and pride, in this case, worked in Theresa's favor. He did not pursue her. He did not make scenes. He had the debt paperwork from the Sawyer farm redrawn with a more generous repayment schedule, whether out of genuine decency or the desire to appear decent to the community, and the effect was the same either way. Edmund Sawyer received the new terms with a combination of gratitude and shame that would take him time to work through. August Trask settled into Mrs. Hollis's boarding house, where he had a small room on the second floor with a view of the street. He was up before sunrise every morning and had already arranged work at the stockyards north of town within his first 2 days in Caldwell, which Mrs. Hollis approved of and mentioned to 3 separate people by noon. The Sunday dinner was not comfortable exactly, but it was honest. Edmund Sawyer sat at the head of the table in the farmhouse kitchen, with Clara on his left and Theresa across from August. Clara, who was 19 and sharp-eyed, and had apparently decided that August Trask was the most interesting thing to happen to their family in years, asked him questions with the unfiltered directness of someone who has not yet learned to be polite about curiosity. "What have you been doing for 3 years?" Clara asked, passing him the biscuits. "Exactly, Clara," Theresa said. "It is a fair question," August said. He took a biscuit and looked at it for a moment. "I went south after I left here, worked a drive from the Texas Panhandle up to Dodge City, then another from Abilene. Spent a winter working a small outfit near San Antonio. Then I came back north, worked the stockyards in Wichita for a season, put money aside. I learned range management and fence work and what it takes to keep cattle through a hard winter without losing half of them." "Why didn't you write?" Clara asked. "Clara," Theresa said again, more quietly. "Because I had nothing to offer yet," August said, and he said it directly to Edmund Sawyer, who had been watching him steadily from the head of the table. "I am aware, Mr. Sawyer, that a man who wants to stand in front of you and make a case for your daughter's future needs to have something more than good intentions. I have worked hard to have more than that. I am not a wealthy man. I do not have land yet. But I have savings and I have skills, and I have the kind of serious regard for your daughter that does not change because it is inconvenient or because the timing is difficult." Edmund was quiet for a moment. The wind pushed at the windows, and somewhere in the yard a horse moved in its stall. "You humiliated Gerald Fitch in front of half this town," Edmund said. "I did not intend humiliation," August said. "I intended honesty. The humiliation, if there was any, came from the situation itself, not from what I said. My daughter was 1 minute from being married." "I know that," August said, and there was something in his voice that was not apology but was not arrogance either. It was the voice of a man who has looked at a hard thing clearly and decided it was still the right thing. "And I am asking you to believe that I came to that church not to create chaos, but because I could not let her walk into a life she had not chosen without knowing she had another option." Edmund looked at his daughter. Theresa met her father's gaze steadily, without flinching. "Did you want him to come?" Edmund asked her. She thought about the answer for a moment, not because she did not know it, but because she wanted to give it to him fully and carefully. "I did not know he was coming," she said. "But when I saw him standing in that doorway, the first thing I felt was not surprise. It was recognition, like something I had been waiting for had finally arrived." She paused. "I think that tells you something." Edmund looked at August again for a long moment with the look of a man who is conducting a private assessment that will determine a great deal. "You'll court her properly," Edmund said at last. "Not a word against that, nothing improper. She is my daughter and she will be treated as such." "She will always be treated as such," August said. "I give you my word on that." Clara beamed across the table with the unguarded delight of a younger sister, who is very pleased with how things are turning out. After dinner, while Clara helped Edmund clear the table, Theresa walked with August out to the fence at the edge of the north pasture, where the grass was just beginning to come back green, and the evening light was going golden and soft over the flat Kansas plain. They walked in comfortable silence for a while, which was something she had remembered about him, that he was a man who did not feel the need to fill every quiet with words. It had always been something she appreciated. "Tell me about Texas," she said finally. He told her. He told her about the first big drive, the noise and the heat, and the miles of nothing that could become something beautiful very suddenly. The way the land opened up in the Texas panhandle, in a way that made a person feel both very small and very free at the same time. He told her about the other hands he had worked with, men from all backgrounds and origins, white and black and Mexican, all of them equal in the trail's demands if not always in the world's treatment of them. And she could tell from the way he spoke that he had seen and understood the unfairness of that clearly, and that it had not sat easily with him. He told her about a fellow hand named Marcus, a black cowboy from Georgia who was the best rider August had ever seen, and who had been paid less than every other man on the drive for it, and how August had spoken to the trail boss about it, and the trail boss had told him it was not his concern, and August had made it his concern anyway by slipping the difference to Marcus when he had the chance. He said this not as a boast but as a simple fact, and Theresa stored it away like something valuable. "And you?" he asked when he had finished. "These 3 years." She told him about her mother's death, which had come 6 months after he left, and the way the whole shape of the family had reorganized itself around the absence, Edmund becoming quieter and more isolated, Clara stepping into domestic responsibilities that were too large for a 16-year-old. She told him about the drought and the debt, and the way the farm had struggled back slowly, a little at a time, and how she had tried to hold the practical side of things together because someone had to. She told him about Gerald Fitch, how it had started as social occasions that her father encouraged, dinners at the Fitch household, the occasional drive through town, and how it had moved gradually and without any single dramatic moment into an understanding, and then into an arrangement, and how she had told herself each time that it was sensible, it was practical, it was what grown women in her circumstances did. "But you weren't happy," August said. "I was not unhappy," she corrected, because she was always precise. "There is a difference. I was not unhappy. I was absent from my own life." She looked out at the pasture at the last light going orange on the grass. "I had stepped out of myself and left someone sensible and practical in my place, and that person was going to marry Gerald Fitch, and I was going to let her." "Until this morning," August said. "Until this morning," she agreed. He stopped walking. She stopped beside him. The evening was very quiet now, just the wind and somewhere the distant low of a cow and the cricket sound starting up from the tall grass at the fence line. "I am going to court you correctly," August said. "I am going to do this the right way, because you deserve the right way. But I want you to know, so there is no confusion at any point, that my intentions are not ambiguous. I am not here to be a friend or a passing comfort. I am here because I intend to ask you to marry me when the time is right, and I want to do it in circumstances where you are choosing me and not simply choosing away from something else." Theresa looked at him in the last of the evening light. She felt a warmth move through her that was entirely different from the cold, dutiful calm she had been wrapped in all morning. It was the warmth of something genuine, something that had been kept banked low for years now suddenly permitted to breathe. "That is a very honest thing to say," she said. "I told you I would be honest with you." "You did," she said. All right, August Trask. Court me correctly. Do this the right way. She turned back toward the farmhouse, and there was something in her step now that had not been there this morning, something lighter and more present. And try to keep up with me. He laughed, and the sound of it was something she wanted to hear again. The weeks of courting that followed were some of the best weeks of Theresa Sawyer's life, though she would not have said that out loud immediately. It took time to let herself believe that good things were allowed to happen to her, that wanting them was not the same as being foolish. August came to the farm on Sundays, always with Edmund's permission asked in advance, which Edmund gave with a gradually softening grudgingness that was, in its own way, a form of approval. He came on Tuesday evenings as well, which had not been formally negotiated but had simply happened naturally, the way things settle into pattern when they belong there. He helped with fence work when he came on Sundays, not because he felt he had to, but because he was a man who was constitutionally unable to stand around doing nothing while there was useful work in front of him. Edmund watched this with the sideways attention of a man who is updating his opinion of someone and is not yet ready to admit he has done so. What Theresa loved in those weeks was the way they talked. They talked about everything, about the land and the town and the changes coming as the railroad expanded, and what that meant for cattle towns like Caldwell, about books when they could get them, about the way the Kansas sky changed personality every hour, about small things and large things and things that had no category. He told her about the land he had been thinking about, north of town, a parcel that had good water access and enough elevation to avoid the worst of the spring flooding. He had spoken to the land agent in a preliminary way, careful to frame it as inquiry rather than plan, because he was not going to build a plan around her answer before she had given it. She told him she thought the North Land was the right choice, because she had grown up knowing this country and she knew where the water ran true and where it lied. "Will you show me?" he asked. She showed him. They rode out one Thursday when the stockyards were closed for maintenance, and the spring air smelled of green things and possibility. She rode her father's bay mare, a horse named Providence that she had been riding since she was 12, and August rode a sorrel gelding from the livery that he handled with the casual ease of someone who has spent more time on horseback than off. She showed him the north parcel, the way the creek bent at the northeast corner, and how the cottonwoods grew thick and healthy there, which was always a sign of reliable water. She showed him the natural windbreak formed by a gentle rise to the west, and the flat stretch to the south that would be excellent for a kitchen garden. He listened to everything she said with complete attention, not the polite half-listening of a man humoring a woman's opinion, but the genuine, focused attention of a man who recognizes that someone knows more than him about something and is grateful for the knowledge. "You'd make a fine partner in planning a property," he said at one point. "I would make a fine partner in a great many things," she said lightly. He looked at her with those dark eyes warm with something she was beginning to let herself name. "I know that," he said. On a Saturday evening in late May, there was a social at the town hall, the kind that happened every season and was attended by most of Caldwell, because entertainment on the frontier was not so plentiful that you passed up a fiddle player and a decent punch bowl. Theresa went with Clara and Edmund, and August met them there. The fiddle player was a thin man named Remy Bouchard who had been playing dances in Kansas for 20 years and knew every song that existed and several that he had invented himself. The hall was warm with lamplight and the sounds of conversation and laughter, and the floor had been cleared for dancing. August asked Theresa to dance. She said yes. She had danced before at socials like this one, with men she knew from town, and once with Gerald Fitch, who danced with the same controlled precision he applied to everything. Dancing with August was entirely different. He was not the most technically polished dancer she had ever seen, but he danced the way he did everything, with full attention and a kind of honest physical ease, and she found that she did not want the song to end. When the song did end, They stood for a moment at the edge of the dance floor, and the sound of the hall was bright around them. "People are watching," she said quietly, with a small smile. "People have been watching since the morning I walked into that church," he said. "Does it bother you?" He considered this. "Not particularly. Does it bother you?" She thought about it honestly. "It used to. I spent a great deal of energy for a great many years worrying about what people saw when they looked at me." She smoothed her skirt with one hand, a habitual gesture. "I find I have less patience for that now." "Good," he said. Clara appeared at Theresa's elbow, flushed from dancing with a young man named Henry Walsh, who worked at the grain merchant, and had been mooning after Clara in the particular helpless way of a very earnest 19-year-old. "Henry wants to know if I can have a second dance," Clara announced. "That is a question for Papa," Theresa said. "Papa is talking to the sheriff about fence regulations and will be occupied for quite some time," Clara said. "August, what do you think?" "I think a second dance is perfectly respectable," August said, and Clara vanished back into the crowd with the speed of someone who has obtained the answer she wanted before anyone could complicate it. "She likes you," Theresa said. "She is easy to like," August said. "She reminds me of you. She is nothing like me." "She argues with me immediately and is always right about it," August said. "She is exactly like you." Theresa looked at him, and there was something so warm in her chest that she had to look away for a moment, out at the dancers and the bright room and the honest, uncomplicated joy of people spending an evening well. "August," she said, still looking at the dancers. "Yes, I am glad you came into that church." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "So am I. I am more glad about that than almost anything I can think of." She looked back at him. "Almost," she said, with the particular dryness she could produce when she wanted to. He smiled, and it changed his whole face, made him look younger and unguarded and exactly like himself. "I expect to be gladder about something yet," he said. "When the time is right." She knew what he meant. She was ready. On a Sunday in the first week of June, August came to the Sawyer farm and asked Edmund Sawyer if he might speak with him privately before dinner. Clara made herself scarce with a tactical efficiency that suggested she knew exactly what was about to happen. Theresa waited in the kitchen, and the waiting was one of the more unusual experiences of her life, because she was not anxious in the way she had always thought waiting would feel. She was steady, she was present, she realized, exactly herself. Edmund and August were in the front room for 20 minutes. When they came out, Edmund's expression was complicated in the way that fathers' expressions are complicated when they have given something they love very much into someone else's care, when it is a difficult thing and the right thing at the same time. Edmund looked at his daughter for a long moment. "He's a good man, Theresa," he said. "I believe that." "So do I, Papa," she said. Edmund nodded once and went to find Clara, which was a very gracious thing to do, giving them the room. August stood before her with the same steadiness he brought to everything, though she noticed his hands were not quite still, and found that endearing in a way she would think about later. "Theresa," he said. "Yes, August," she said. "I told you I would ask when the time was right, and when it was clearly a choice you were making towards something and not away from something. I believe that is now." He took a breath. "I love you. I have been in love with you since the summer we spent arguing about your father's fences, and I do not expect to stop. I am asking you to marry me, not because of what I can offer you materially, though I will work every day to make sure that is substantial, but because I believe that you and I together are something better than either of us alone, and because I think you believe that too." She looked at him for a long moment. The June sunlight was coming through the kitchen window, falling across the floor in a warm square, and outside the birds were making their summer sounds, and everything felt very alive. "Yes," she said. He looked at her as if he needed to make sure he had heard correctly. "Yes," she said again. "August Trask, yes, I will marry you." He crossed the room in 3 steps and took both her hands in his, and they stood there in the kitchen sunlight, both of them holding on, and it felt nothing like the hollow morning she had started the day in 2 months ago. It felt full and true and entirely real. "I'm going to make you very happy," he said, very quietly, very seriously. "I know," she said. "And you should know that I intend to do the same for you." He laughed, and it was the kind of laugh that comes from genuine, uncomplicated joy, and she had already decided she was going to make him laugh like that as often as she possibly could for the rest of their lives. The summer of 1882 moved forward with the particular momentum of a life being built. August put a formal offer on the North land parcel in June, and the land agent, a man named Porter who wore a hat that was too large for his head and who knew more about Caldwell County than anyone else alive, processed the transaction within a fortnight. The parcel was 120 acres, with the creek at the northeast corner and the natural windbreak to the west that Theresa had identified, and it was, by the assessment of anyone who looked at it honestly, good land. August began building. He hired 2 men, brothers named Cole and Sam Dietrich, who were capable carpenters, and he worked alongside them every day that the stockyards did not require him. The house went up through July, a solid structure with proper foundations and a covered porch that ran along the south-facing front, because Theresa had mentioned once that a covered porch was the thing she most wanted in a house of her own, a place where you could sit in the evening and watch the sky change. She came out to the building site on Saturdays to see the progress. She and August walked the property together, planning where the garden would go and where the cattle pen should be placed relative to the prevailing wind, and they had conversations about the practical details of their future life that were, to Theresa's constant slight surprise, among the most deeply satisfying conversations she had ever had. She had not realized, until now, how much she had been missing the particular pleasure of making real plans with a person who genuinely valued her perspective. Clara came with her sometimes and contributed opinions freely, and August took Clara's opinions with the same genuine attention he gave to everything, which cemented Clara's already decided admiration of him thoroughly. Edmund came once, on a hot Saturday in late July, walking the property with August in a way that started formal and ended with both of them standing at the creek, talking about cattle management with the comfortable ease of men who have found unexpected common ground. Theresa watched from a distance, standing in the shade of a cottonwood, and felt something ease in her chest. There were still difficult things. Gerald Fitch's presence in town was a permanent social reality, and Caldwell was not large enough for anyone to fully avoid anyone else. The encounters were infrequent and civil, which was the best that could be asked for. Fitch had, within weeks of the failed wedding, begun keeping company with the widow of a land surveyor named Mrs. Pauline Greer, who was closer to his age and who, by all accounts, was considerably more suited to him temperamentally. By August, Fitch and Mrs. Greer were being seen together at church and at the hotel dining room, and the town had quietly redirected its attention accordingly. The debt repayment schedule that Fitch had extended to Edmund had been drawn up with enough generosity that the farm was no longer in immediate danger. Edmund worked steadily to meet the payments, and Theresa helped with the accounts when he allowed her to, which he increasingly did now that something in the family's atmosphere had relaxed and he had stopped trying to manage everything alone. The wedding was planned for September. Not in the church on Main Street, though Reverend Fletcher offered it, and there was no ill feeling toward him. August and Theresa chose to be married at the farm, in the yard under the old oak tree that had been growing at the northwest corner of the Sawyer property since before anyone currently living in Caldwell had arrived. It felt like the right place, rooted and honest, with the open Kansas sky above it. The morning of the wedding was clear and warm, the kind of September day that feels like a gift before the cold arrives, golden and generous. Theresa dressed in her room, not in the ivory cotton dress from the spring, which she had given to a young woman in town who had admired it, and whom it fit better in temperament, but in a dress of pale blue cotton with cream embroidery at the collar and cuffs that she and Clara had made together over the course of August, spending evenings at the kitchen table with oil lamps and good thread. Clara pinned her hair again, more simply this time, because Theresa had asked for something that felt like herself. "Are you nervous?" Clara asked, working a pin into place. "No," Theresa said, and it was true in a way it had not been true the last time she had stood in this room in a wedding dress. "You were nervous in April," Clara said. "I know. This is different." "Very much so," Theresa said. Clara finished with the hair and came around to look at her sister's face. Clara had turned 20 over the summer and had grown into a young woman of considerable good sense and surprising wisdom, and she looked at Theresa now with eyes that were very bright. "Mama would have loved him," Clara said. Theresa took her sister's hand. "I know she would have." Outside, August Trask stood under the old oak tree with Reverend Fletcher and waited. He had put on a dark coat and a clean shirt and a new hat, and he had shaved with particular care, and Cole Dietrich, who had somehow become a friend over the summer of building work and who was standing beside him as an informal witness, had told him he looked fine and he should stop adjusting his collar. The yard was filled with people. Not a grand crowd, but a real one, the kind gathered by genuine warmth rather than social obligation. Edmund's neighboring farmers, Mrs. Holly's from the boarding house, the Dietrich brothers and their wives, the fiddle player Remy Bouchard, who had been invited because Theresa liked his music. A handful of townspeople who had watched the whole story unfold since April and were deeply invested in its conclusion. When Theresa came out of the farmhouse door on her father's arm, the September light hit her and August forgot how to breathe for a moment. She walked toward him with the steady, present step of a woman who is exactly where she intends to be. And when she reached him and Edmund placed her hand in his, her fingers were warm and certain. "Hello," she said quietly for only him to hear. "Hello," he said. Reverend Fletcher began, and the ceremony was straightforward and sincere, without excessive ornamentation. When it came time for the vows, August looked at Theresa and spoke them not as a recitation, but as an actual declaration, each word placed carefully and meant completely. Theresa returned them in kind, her voice clear and steady and full. When Reverend Fletcher said they were husband and wife, the crowd around the old oak tree made a sound that was warm and uncomplicated, and Cole Dietrich said something quietly that made the men near him laugh, and Clara cried with the energetic sincerity of someone who has been looking forward to crying all morning. August kissed his wife, and Theresa kissed her husband, and Remy Bouchard started playing something lively on the fiddle, and the September afternoon opened up around them, full and golden and real. They moved into the new house on the north parcel in late September, when the finishing work on the interior was complete, and the floors had been fitted with pine boards that still smelled of fresh cut wood. Theresa had sewn curtains for every window over the summer, kept in a trunk in her room, and they went up on the first day. August stood back and looked at the kitchen window with its new curtains and said, very seriously, "Now it looks like a home." "It looks like our home," Theresa corrected, and the distinction mattered. They settled into the rhythms of their life with an ease that surprised even Theresa, who had not been certain, before living it, how two people who had been apart for 3 years, and who had spent only a summer and a few months of courting together, would manage the close daily reality of a shared life. What she found was that August in proximity was completely consistent with August in memory and August in courtship, that there was no version of him that was performed or managed, that he was simply himself at all times, which was one of the most restful things she had ever encountered. He was up before sunrise, which she was used to. She was up not long after, and they shared the mornings the way people share things that belong to both of them equally. Coffee made strong and drunk on the covered porch in the cool air with the Kansas sunrise happening in its dramatic seasonal fashion, and the world feeling very large and very manageable at the same time. He ran cattle on the north parcel through the fall, purchasing a small starting herd with the remainder of his savings, and Theresa managed the accounts with the precision and intelligence that her father had always somewhat reluctantly admired, and that August simply accepted as one of the essential and valuable facts about her. She kept the ledgers, tracked the costs, negotiated with the supplier at the feed store with a directness that surprised men who were not used to dealing with women in that capacity. When the feed store manager, a man named Garrett, tried to give her a price that was different from what he quoted the men who came before her in line, she asked him, clearly and without heat, to explain the discrepancy. He could not. He gave her the standard price. She thanked him politely and left, and on the way home told August about it, not as a complaint but as information. August listened, and the expression on his face was the particular still expression he wore when something angered him and he was deciding how to handle it. "What would you like me to do about it?" he asked, because he understood clearly that it was her situation to manage. "Nothing at the moment," she said. "I handled it. I only wanted you to know." "Good," he said, and there was a firmness in it that meant he was paying attention and would remember, and that was enough. The first winter in the new house was a hard one, as Kansas winters had a way of being hard, the cold arriving in November with the serious intention of a thing that means business. They banked the stove high and kept the animals close, and made use of the firewood that August and Cole Dietrich had stacked against the western wall of the house through October. The isolation of winter brought them even closer, which Theresa had not entirely anticipated. Without the social structure of town and the daily routines of warmer weather, they were simply two people in a house together, dependent on each other's company and their own. She found that the company was very good. They played cards in the evenings and argued about them cheerfully. August read aloud from whatever book was available, with more expression and interpretation than she expected from a man who had spent most of his adult years outdoors rather than in parlors. She read aloud in return, and they discussed what they read with the same genuine engagement they brought to every other topic. She discovered that he could not sleep in total silence and needed some ambient sound, which she solved by leaving the bedroom window cracked a quarter-inch even in January, enough to let in the sound of the wind. He discovered that she made her most important decisions very early in the morning before she had spoken to anyone, and learned to wait until she had had her coffee before asking anything that required a considered answer. These were small things. They were also everything. In February, Theresa told August she thought she might be expecting a child. She told him on a Tuesday morning on the porch, with the February cold around them and both of them wrapped in wool and holding their coffee. He was very still for a moment, and she watched his face and saw the thing that moved across it, a kind of wonder so complete and unguarded that she felt it in her own chest like something landing home. "Theresa," he said, and that was all he said for a moment, because the word was doing significant work. "I am not entirely certain yet," she said practically. "I want to speak to the doctor in town before we make it definite." "Of course," he said, "but I think so," she said. "I think so too," he said, which did not make logical sense, but she understood exactly what he meant, and she laughed, and he laughed, and the February cold was suddenly irrelevant. The doctor in Caldwell confirmed it in March. Dr. Albright was a careful, gray-haired man who had been delivering babies in southern Kansas for 15 years, and he told Theresa that everything was proceeding well and that she should expect their child in August or September. She told Clara the same week, and Clara's response was so enthusiastic that it was audible from the other side of the farmhouse, which made Edmund appear in the kitchen doorway to see what had happened. And then his face did the complicated thing that fathers' faces do, the thing that is grief and pride and joy and love all at once. The spring of 1883 came in warm and generous, and the Trask cattle operation expanded carefully. August hired a young man named Sam Rays, who was 20 and had come up from the territory looking for steady work, and who was a capable and hardworking hand. Sam Rays had grown up with a Mexican mother and a father who had worked ranching in Texas, and he knew cattle with a fluency that came from a childhood spent watching them. August paid him the same wage as anyone else he would have hired, which was not always how things were done in Caldwell County in 1883, and which was the only way August intended to do business. Theresa planted the kitchen garden in May, which she had been planning since before the house was finished. She planted it on the south side of the house in the full sun, with beans and squash and tomatoes, and a row of sunflowers along the fence because she wanted them, and they made the yard look right. August built her a proper fence for the garden in an afternoon and said nothing about it, just built it and stepped back, which she appreciated. Clara came to help plant in May, and they worked the garden together the way they had worked many things growing up, in a comfortable sibling rhythm with a great deal of talking and some laughter. Henry Walsh, who had been steadily and sincerely courting Clara since the previous summer, came with her and assisted with the heavier work, and was clearly in a state of uncomplicated happiness that his presence was welcomed without question. "He's a good one," August said to Theresa that evening, watching from the porch as Henry Walsh's buggy disappeared down the road toward town. "He is," Theresa agreed. "He adores her. She knows her own mind," August said. "She has always known her own mind," Theresa said with the fond certainty of an older sister. "She just needed to grow into being confident about it." The summer moved through June and July with the long days and the hard work of a working ranch, and Theresa moved through the summer pregnancy with the practicality she brought to everything, making adjustments when necessary and ignoring people who suggested she should be doing less. August watched her with an attentiveness that she would not have called hovering, because it was not anxious or controlling, but was simply the attention of a man who loves someone and is paying close attention to how she is. He brought her cold water without being asked when the July heat was brutal. He took over the heaviest of the fence work without making a scene of it. He asked her each evening how she was and listened to the actual answer, and when she said she was tired and the heat was difficult, he said so it was and made no comparison to what she should be able to endure. On a warm night in August, with the late summer stars very thick above the Kansas plain, their son was born. Dr. Albright came out from town with his bag, and Clara was there as well, and August sat outside on the porch for most of it in the way of husbands of that era, though he had clearly decided that if anything at all sounded wrong he was going in regardless of convention. Nothing sounded wrong. At some point past midnight, the sound that came from inside the house was the particular unmistakable sound of a new person announcing their arrival in the world, and August stood up from the porch steps so fast that he knocked over the coffee cup he had set down beside him and did not notice. Clara appeared in the doorway a few minutes later, flushed and bright-eyed, and said, "You have a son, August. Come see your wife." He went in. Theresa was sitting up against the pillows, tired in a way that went all the way through her, but her face was illuminated by a kind of specific wonder that he had never seen on it before, and in her arms was a small red-faced person who had very strong opinions about the situation he had just found himself in. August stood at the bedside and looked at his wife and his son, and the thing he felt was not describable in the vocabulary available to a working cowboy in 1883, or perhaps in any vocabulary in any year, the enormous specific love of a person standing in the presence of everything that matters. "He's healthy," Theresa said. Her voice was exhausted and deeply content. "Dr. Albright says he's perfectly healthy." "And you?" August asked. "I am perfectly healthy," she said firmly. He sat on the edge of the bed, careful not to disturb her, and looked at the face of his son, which was small and red and entirely serious. "He looks like he has a great many thoughts," August said. "He comes by that honestly," Theresa said, with the dry warmth she could produce even at 1 in the morning after giving birth. They named him Edmund James Trask. Edmund, after her father, which made Edmund Sawyer go outside and look at the sky for a few minutes when he was told, in the way that men of that era and that emotional depth handled things they found moving. James, after August's younger brother who had died of fever in Texas when August was 19, the loss of whom he had carried quietly and who deserved to be remembered. Edmund James Trask was a vigorous and interested baby who grew into a vigorous and interested child. He had August's dark eyes and Theresa's precise and observant way of looking at things, and from very early it was clear that he had opinions about the world and intended to communicate them. The Trask ranch grew steadily through the mid-1880s. August was a careful and practical rancher, not given to expansion faster than his means could support it, and the operation grew in the measured way of something being built to last rather than to impress. By 1885 they had a healthy herd. The house had been added to with a proper second room for Edmund James, and Sam Rays had become not just a hired hand, but an essential part of how the place ran, a trusted presence who ate dinner with the family twice a week. Sam Rays had also, in the course of 1884, met a woman named Isabella Medina, who had come north with her family from the territory, and their courtship had proceeded with a quiet and mutual certainty. August and Theresa had attended their wedding in the spring of 1885 with genuine warmth, and Theresa had helped Isabella settle into the small house they built at the edge of the Trask property, where Sam would be nearby for the ranch work. Clara married Henry Walsh in October of 1884, in a ceremony at the Sawyer farm under the same oak tree where August and Theresa had been married 2 years prior. It was a very good wedding. Theresa stood with her sister beforehand and looked at Clara's face, which was the face of someone heading exactly where they want to go, and felt the particular satisfaction of watching someone you love be well and truly happy. Edmund Sawyer, seeing both daughters married to men of genuine character, seemed to find a kind of peace that had been unavailable to him since his wife's death. He continued working the farm, paying down the last of the Fitch debt through 1884, and settling it completely in February of 1885, which he told Theresa about at Sunday dinner, with a quiet finality that felt like setting down a weight he had been carrying for a long time. Theresa and August drove the last of the winter cattle to the stockyards in Caldwell in March of 1886, and it was the best season they had had, prices up from the previous year and the herd healthy. On the way home in the wagon, Edmund James asleep between them with the profound totality of a 2-year-old who has decided sleep is happening regardless of circumstances, Theresa looked at the flat Kansas land going gold in the afternoon and felt the fullness of her life with a clarity that was nearly overwhelming. "What are you thinking?" August asked, the reins easy in his hands. "I am thinking that I did not know it could be like this," she said. He glanced at her. "Like what?" "Like this," she said, meaning everything. The wagon and the child and the land and the man beside her and the afternoon, and the life that was real and chosen and hers. "I did not know a person could feel this settled and this alive at the same time. I thought they were opposites." He was quiet for a moment in that particular way of his. "They're not," he said. "No," she agreed, "they are not." Edmund James stirred in his sleep, made a sound of vague protest, and resettled with his head against Theresa's arm. "I want to tell you something," August said. "Tell me." "That morning I rode into Caldwell," he said. "I had been riding since the night before. I rode from Wichita through the night because I had been sitting in a rooming house in Wichita for 3 weeks working up to it, and I finally just got on the horse and rode because I knew if I waited one more day I would not go." He paused. "I did not know if you would still want to hear it. I did not know if I was too late. I thought I might be too late and I came anyway." She looked at him. The afternoon light was falling across his face, the lines a little deeper than they had been in 1882 and the gray just beginning at his temples, and he was more himself to her now than any face she knew. "You were not too late," she said. "No," he said. "But I almost was, and I need you to know that I understand that. That I know what it cost you, what I left you to manage alone for 3 years, the choices you were making without knowing you had other ones. I know what I owe you for that." "August," she said carefully. "I don't say it from guilt," he continued. "I say it because I want you to know I see it. I see what you carried and I see what it cost. And I want the rest of our life together to be the thing that makes it worth having waited." She looked at him for a long moment, this serious, honest man who had ridden through the night and walked into a church full of people, and said the true thing out loud because he had finally decided that being brave was more important than being safe. "It already is," she said. "It has already been that for a long time." He reached across Edmund James, careful and warm, and took her hand, and they drove the rest of the way home in the comfortable silence of people who have said the important things and do not need to fill the rest. In the spring of 1887, Theresa told August she was expecting their second child. This time she told him at breakfast over coffee, with the particular directness she brought to important information. August put his cup down and looked at her with the same wonder he had produced 4 years ago, undiminished by repetition. "When?" he asked. "October, if Dr. Albright's arithmetic is correct," she said. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "How are you feeling?" "Somewhat less organized than usual," she said, which for Theresa was a significant admission. "The mornings are difficult. Tell me what you need," he said. "I need you to take over the ledger work for 3 weeks until this passes," she said. "I trust you to do it accurately if I review it afterward." He absorbed this. "Done," he said. "And I need the second bedroom expanded before October," she said. "Already thinking about it," he said. "Of course you were," she said, with the warm dryness that was entirely her. "The summer of 1887 was a good one." Edmund James, now nearly 4, was old enough to follow August around the property with the dedication of a small person who has decided that his father is the most interesting creature in the world. August bore this with patience and genuine pleasure, narrating what he was doing in terms that a 4-year-old could understand and answering questions with the same honest directness he brought to adult conversation. Theresa watched them from the porch some mornings and felt the specific and profound pleasure of seeing the man she loved be the father she had known he would be. Clara and Henry Walsh were expecting their first child as well, due in the late summer, and the two sisters spent considerable time together through the spring and summer in a way that echoed their childhood, working side by side in the kitchen or the garden, talking about everything. Henry Walsh's firstborn was a daughter, born in August and named for Clara's mother. Clara was radiant and exhausted and completely herself in new motherhood, and Henry Walsh was so thoroughly transformed by fatherhood that he appeared to have left his previous personality behind entirely and replaced it with one that was mostly wonder. Theresa's second child arrived in October of 1887, and this time it was a daughter. She was small and had Theresa's brown eyes and August's dark hair, and from the first hour it was clear she was going to be someone with very strong preferences about everything. They named her Margaret Rose Trask. Margaret for August's mother, who had raised him and his brother alone after their father left when August was 8, a woman August spoke of with the particular reverence of someone who knows exactly where their character came from. Rose for the wildflowers that grew along the creek at the northeast corner of their property, which were the first thing Theresa had noticed the day she showed August the north parcel, which felt like a good place to start. Edmund James regarded his new sister with the wary interest of a 4-year-old, who has just realized the household has changed configuration. He stood at the edge of the bed and looked at Margaret Rose with a serious expression for a long moment, and then said, with the gravity of a child who has given this careful thought, "She is very small." Theresa agreed that she was. He nodded, apparently satisfied that the situation had been assessed correctly, and went back to his business. By the winter of 1887, the Trask Ranch was a genuine and functioning enterprise. The herd was healthy and growing, the accounts were sound, and the house was warm and full in the way that houses are when they contain people who have chosen to be there. August had extended the covered porch in the fall of 1886, making it wider and adding a second bench, because on autumn evenings when Edmund James was in bed and the work was done, he and Theresa sat on that porch, and the space had begun to feel important. It was where they talked most honestly, with the wide Kansas sky above them and the sounds of the night and the lamp burning low in the kitchen window behind them. On one such evening, in November of 1887, Margaret rose asleep and Edmund James finally persuaded to his own bed after negotiating several extra stories. They sat on the porch in their coats with the early winter cold settling in around them and the stars very bright. "Do you ever think about leaving?" Theresa asked. August looked at her. "Leaving? Going somewhere else, somewhere bigger. Some people from town have been talking about moving further west, Oregon, California." He thought about this with his characteristic honest consideration, not dismissing the question but actually thinking about it. "No," he said at last. "This is where I want to be. This is our land and our people and our place." He paused. "Do you?" She looked out at the dark of the Kansas night, at the flat horizon and the enormous sky. "No," she said. "I think I was asking because I was curious what you would say." "And," he said, "you said exactly what I thought you would," she said. "Is that a good thing?" "It is a very good thing," she said. "It is one of the things I love most, that you are the same person every time I look." He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and they sat in the cold November air with the ranch quiet around them and the stars doing their enormous indifferent work above the plains. "I love you," he said, in the uncomplicated way he had come to say it, which was not with ceremony but just as a thing that was true and therefore worth saying. "I love you," she said back, in the same way. The years moved forward with the honest pace of years that are being lived rather than endured. Edmund James Trask grew into a boy of considerable intelligence and opinions who was happiest outdoors with animals and second happiest arguing about things with his mother, who always argued back and usually won, and was clearly delighted by him. He was 7 when he started riding his own horse, a gentle gray named Cloud that August had selected specifically for steadiness, and he took to it with a natural ease that made August quietly very proud. Margaret Rose Trask grew into a child of fierce determination and enormous charm, which she deployed with a strategic understanding that suggested she had been paying close attention to how the world worked from a very young age. She adored her father and worked her older brother with an efficiency that Edmund James only recognized years later. She had Theresa's precision and August's patience, and some quality that belonged entirely to herself that no one had been able to fully name, but that everyone recognized. August Trask turned 30 in the spring of 1886, and Theresa threw him a dinner at the farmhouse because he had said he did not want a fuss, which she had interpreted correctly to mean he wanted a small and genuine gathering rather than a large and performative one. Edmund Sawyer was there, and Clara and Henry Walsh, and Sam and Isabella Reyes, and Cole Dietrich and his wife, and Remy Bouchard, who played the fiddle in the kitchen after dinner because that was apparently what Remy Bouchard did at celebrations. August, sitting at the head of the table that Theresa had set with the good dishes and candles, looked around the room at the people who were there and the life that had assembled itself around him, and felt a gratitude so specific and complete that he did not try to express it in words. Later that night, after everyone had gone and the children were asleep and the kitchen had been put to rights, Theresa found him standing on the porch looking out at the dark. She stood beside him and slipped her hand into his. "Happy?" she asked. "Extraordinarily," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder. "Good," she said. "You deserve to be." He turned to look at her in the dark, and even now, 8 years after standing in a church doorway with dust on his coat and the most important words of his life not yet said, the way he looked at her was the same. That direct, serious, completely present attention. "So do you," he said. "And I intend to make sure you know that for the rest of your life." She looked up at him with the warm, grounded certainty that had replaced the hollowness of that spring morning in 1882, and she believed him entirely, because August Trask was a man who meant what he said and said what he meant and had never once in all their years together given her reason to doubt it. "I know it," she said. "I have known it for a long time." He kissed her, There on the porch in the Kansas night, with the stars above the plains and the cattle quiet in the east pasture and their children asleep in the house behind them. And it was the same as the first time and completely different, the way things are when they have been worn smooth and certain by time and kept and love. Edmund Sawyer lived another 12 years after the wedding at the oak tree, growing gradually more settled and less isolated, and more given to dropping by the Trask ranch for Sunday dinners, and playing on the floor with his grandchildren in the comfortable and unguarded way of grandfathers. He paid off the last of his debt in 1885, and he died in the spring of 1894, peacefully in his own bed, and was buried at the Caldwell cemetery next to his wife. Theresa and Clara held each other at the grave and said nothing that needed to be said out loud, because sisters understand each other's grief without translation. August stood at Theresa's side through the whole of it, solid and present, and that was exactly what she needed. Clara and Henry Walsh had 3 children eventually, 2 daughters and a son, and lived in Caldwell proper, where Henry had expanded the grain merchant into a substantial business. They were frequent and beloved visitors to the Trask ranch, and the 2 families were woven into each other's lives in the comfortable and daily way of people who have genuinely chosen one another. Sam and Isabella Rays had 2 sons, and Sam eventually became a partial partner in the Trask ranch in a formal arrangement that August proposed in 1889, which reflected the reality of how essential Sam was to the operation. The arrangement was fair and practical, and Sam received it with the quiet dignity of a man who has worked hard in the expectation that fairness was possible even when it was not guaranteed. August Trask, in the winter of 1890, was asked to serve on the County Land Commission, which involved mediating disputes about property lines and water rights across the county. He agreed to do it and served for 4 years, and Theresa helped him prepare for every session, reading through the relevant papers and giving him her analysis with the same directness she had always applied to everything. Several landowners who came before the commission with disputes later commented, without knowing who had done the analysis, that the commission's decisions were unusually well-reasoned. Theresa found this very satisfying to know. The last evening of the summer of 1892, when the children were 9 and 4 respectively, and the ranch was running at its best capacity, and the covered porch had acquired 2 rocking chairs that had replaced the bench years ago, August and Theresa sat in those chairs in the late August warmth, and watched the sunset go through its full range of colors over the Kansas plain, which it did with the dramatic commitment of something that knows it has an audience. Edmund James was already asleep, having worn himself out with a full day of riding and fence work, alongside his father in the way that 9-year-olds do when they have decided they are grown. Margaret Rose had been read to and kissed, and had fallen asleep holding a small carved horse that August had made for her birthday from a piece of cottonwood, which she carried everywhere with the devotion that children give to objects their parents have made by hand. The house behind them was quiet and warm and full of the evidence of their life, the books on the shelf and the curtains at the windows and the good dishes in the cupboard, and the children sleeping and the lamp burning low and the accounts settled, and the cattle healthy and the land theirs and real. Theresa rocked slowly in her chair and looked at the last colors draining from the western sky, deep orange going to rose going to purple, and she thought about a morning 10 years ago when she had stood before a mirror in her childhood bedroom holding a bouquet of wildflowers and feeling hollow. She thought about the door of a church swinging open. She thought about a man walking toward her with dust on his coat and the truth on his face, walking slowly because he had already made his decision and hurrying was beside the point. She thought about all the ways a life could go, and all the ways this one had, and the extraordinary and specific gratitude she felt for the version she was living. "August," she said. "Yes." He turned from the sunset to look at her, and the last light was on his face, and he was exactly himself. "Thank you," she said. He looked at her for a moment the way he always looked at her, with full and genuine attention. "For what?" he asked. "For coming back," she said. "For walking through that door, for saying the true thing when it needed saying." She paused. "For all of it." He reached across the space between the rocking chairs and took her hand, the way he had done 10 years ago in a church doorway and 100 times since, a gesture so habitual and so complete that it had become one of the languages they spoke. "I was late," he said. "You were right on time," she said. He looked at her and she looked at him, and between them was 10 years of mornings and arguments about fences and letters not answered, and letters answered, and a church full of people, and a walk in the June light, and a promise made under an old oak tree, and a son with dark eyes, and a daughter with strong opinions, and a life built with their own hands from the inside out, from honesty and choosing and real love. The stars were beginning to appear above the Kansas plain, the same enormous sky that had hung above Caldwell for as long as anyone living could remember, the same sky that had watched everything that mattered happen beneath it. August Trask held his wife's hand in the summer dark, and Theresa Trask held her husband's hand in return, and neither of them needed to say anything at all, and the silence was the most comfortable, abundant thing in the world. The ranch was quiet. The children were sleeping. The stars were out, and the life that had been chosen by both of them in the best and most genuine way that any life can be chosen went on.